All right, then Econ friends, welcome back to another video. Thanks for joining. We're continuing on in our big discussion on supply and demand. In our last video, we tackled buyer behavior, buyer incentive, and the law of demand. In this video, we're going to switch gears and take it to the seller side, the supplier side, and discuss the law of supply. Now, a couple of things I want to bring up before we jump into the material. The first thing is that in terms of the format and the flow, you're going to find a lot of similarities between this material and the stuff we did in law of demand, because there's still going to be this law, and we're going to have a chance to express it with symbols and schedules and curves. There's still going to be a discussion of surplus, this time called producer surplus. We're still going to cover elasticity, except it'll be supply elasticity. And we're still going to cover the idea, the difference, the critical difference between supply and quantity supplied. So we're going to move through this one a little bit quicker because in terms of the structure, it'll mirror the demand discussion. However, it's really important that as you jump from the demand lecture to the supply lecture, you have to change your mindset. A lot of students, they drop the ball in this lecture because their mind is still in terms of demand and buyer, okay? And that's now done, at least for the moment. In this lecture, we're talking about law of supply. And as a result of that, you need to switch gears mentally and stop thinking as a buyer and start thinking as a seller. That's a lot harder because you've been buying stuff forever and a day, and unless you actually have a job and think about selling your labor, or maybe you sell fake IDs or illicit drugs out of your, well, now your mom's basement, not your dorm room anymore, but you get the idea. Unless you actually have a business, it's hard to intuitively think about supply. So one of your challenges in this lecture is to make yourself think, what does a supplier do? They sell, but like, what are their incentives? What motivates them? And let that guide you. All right. With that said, let's jump in to the law of supply. And let me get back to a decent color here. Try this again. Law of supply. All right. So the law of supply is, again, another economic principle, an economic law that states that there is a positive or direct relationship between the price of an item and the quantity supplied of that item. So again, the law of supply states that there is a positive or direct relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, ceteris paribus. Because of this law, we know that supply curves slope upward. We can express this law, as always, through symbols. As the price of an item goes up, that will lead to the quantity supplied going up. We can say that as the price of the item goes down, this will lead to the quantity supplied going down. Because it's a direct relationship, we can also map out a supply curve, which we'll do later. We would have P, 0, and Q on our axes, and we would have an upward sloping curve that we would label S. Okay, so that's the law of supply. When you think about the law of supply, you have to put yourself in the lens of sellers, because the law of supply reflects the incentives that sellers face, and it also reflects the opportunity costs of production. Okay, remember, the opportunity cost is what you have to give up to do something. So the opportunity cost of production is the total economic cost, explicit and implicit, right? Cash outlays and opportunity costs. It's the total economic cost of producing a good or service. And when you think about the fact that sellers are motivated, they're incentivized to pursue profit. And when you think about the fact that they have to cover opportunity costs to make the endeavor profitable, it becomes pretty clear why higher prices will motivate sellers to want to sell more. Higher prices will lead to more revenues and probably more profits. And imagine a situation where the marginal cost of production rises over time, which we've discussed. As the price goes higher and higher, production that at one point would not have been profitable because the money coming in wasn't going to cover the outlay of expenses, right? As the prices go up, 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 production that at one point was not profitable now can be profitable. So another reason why as prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. Okay, let's talk really quick about a definition. The idea of profit, we've gone over this. Profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. Firms earn a profit. They're motivated by profit. They want to make profit, but they only make a profit when the revenues from what they sell exceed the opportunity cost of the resources used to make them. Notice that that line right there has a lot of subtlety in it, right? Number one, firms are going to be motivated by high prices. The higher the price is, the more revenues they're going to bring in, the easier chance to cover opportunity costs, right? But notice that firms still have to get you to buy things as a buyer. So the law of supply and the pursuit of profits also imply that firms have to make the right items. They have to make the things that consumers want to buy. And because you have to cover the opportunity cost, the law of supply and the pursuit of profit also imply that in a competitive market, firms are going to have an incentive to try to be as efficient as possible, to drive those costs down. Because again, if profit is the spread between what you bring in and what you send out, between your revenues coming in and your costs going out, anything, education of your workforce, investment in better factories, investment in robotics, all these different things that push your costs down, increase your profits. So you can think about this through the lens of seller incentive. And then to really think about good economic thinking, you try to align seller incentive with the broader social welfare goals that we have of efficiency and things like that, okay? Anyway, so that's our law of supply. As we did with demand in the supply area, there is a distinct difference between quantity supplied and supply. Quantity supplied, as you can extend from our demand discussion, quantity supplied refers to the amount of a particular good that sellers are willing and able to supply at a specific price. Okay, one price, one QS. Supply, on the other hand, which is the whole curve, refers to the amount that sellers will sell at each and every hypothetical price. Not just at one, but at all the different possible prices, what are all the different potential sales levels, okay? Seen a different way, again, extending from our demand discussion, quantity supplied is one particular point. Supply is the function that takes all those points together, okay? Supply can be represented, as demand could, with a supply schedule or with a supply curve, which we have here. I believe this is for Mario's Pizza, okay? I personally prefer, Alejo's, but what are you gonna do? And you see right here, a couple of things. On our supply schedule, you see that our columns include price and quantity supply. Those are the two variables that we're comparing. Notice at a price of $30, so a lot for a pizza, right? That pizza better be really good. Mario is gonna wanna sell 5 pizzas. And you can see predictably that as the price of pizzas falls from 30 to 25 and down, Mario's incentives change and Mario's going to want to supply fewer and fewer pizzas. Nothing new here, okay? Price goes down, quantity supplied goes down because the incentives change. As price goes down, recall that we're moving down line by line from one particular QS combination to another one, honoring the law of supply that as the prices go down, the QS goes down, okay? We can then move from a supply schedule to a supply curve by simply taking each of these individual points here and plotting them. So at a price of $30, Mario will supply 5 pizzas. So you would say $30 and you would go over, and 5 pizzas and you would go up, and that would be one of your QS points. You know, at a price of 20, he's going to supply 3. You would start at 20, you would go across, you would go to 3, you would go up. This right here, another QS point. And if you connect them, you get the idea. You're going to have this upward curve called supply. Again, it's critical to differentiate between quantity supplied and supply. Again, quantity supplied is one particular price and quantity point. It corresponds to one particular line, one particular line, one particular line, or one particular point, one particular point, one particular point. Supply puts all of those points together into one big function, puts all those points together into one big curve, okay? So that's our difference between supply and quantity supplied. Much like we did with the law of demand, we have a couple of extensions that we can take from the supply curve forward. The first one, the idea of producer surplus. This is, again, the seller. This is the seller's net gain or economic surplus from a sale. Again, this is the flip side, right? The cousin to consumer surplus, but it goes back to that big idea that we established way back when, that trade creates value, and that when people combine to trade, there's win-wins. Consumer surplus, last time in the law of demand, consumer surplus is the gain to buyers. Producer surplus is the seller's gain. It's the seller's economic surplus. It's the seller's net benefit when a sale is made, okay? Producers sell, they do it to make gain, to make profit, to make, benefit. Producer surplus is a way to quantify or graphically show that benefit. Because we define producer surplus as the difference between the price that they would be willing to accept and the actual price that they get, just so you know, the actual price, that's pretty easy, that's just price. The price that they're willing to accept is typically going to be the marginal cost of production in a competitive market. If it cost a guy $2 to make an additional product, he will probably sell it for $2 because you want to cover those costs, okay? But seen in an easier way, the willingness to sell is simply the supply curve, because by definition, the supply curve right here reflected all the potential amounts that sellers are willing and able to sell at different prices. So again, this idea that producer surplus is the difference between willingness to sell and price received tells us that producer surplus is a triangle bordered by the supply curve on one side and the price on the other. This triangle is above supply and below price, and we call this triangle producer surplus. Much like consumer surplus, we can measure producer surplus simply through, calling it triangle ABC, or we can use the triangle formula, 1/2 of base times height, and plug in these values to actually calculate the size of the producer surplus. Okay, so we know that we have producer surplus. It's the triangle bordered by price and supply, and it represents the gains to sellers. We would also see that there is going to be a change in producer surplus based on a change in price. Let's talk about that. Let's say first that prices go down. We're going to predict that this is probably not good for sellers, but let's figure it out graphically. Producer surplus, again, is the gap, the triangle between the supply curve and the price. In this case, it would be, this triangle right here. This is our producer surplus, okay? Let us assume that the prices fall. We're going to call this the original price. We'll call that price 0. Let's assume that prices fall from price 0 down to price 1. Prices fall, we have a new price. Well, you know what's going to happen. At a new price, the triangle below price and above the supply curve is going to get smaller. So we would argue, we would demonstrate that if price falls, producer surplus falls, ceteris paribus. Much like demand, we can measure the actual size of that fall by comparing the size of the original triangle to the size of the new triangle and figuring out the difference. So there you go. Okay, really quickly, we can also do this just for shits and gigs to figure out the impact the other way. So let's say that the prices go up. We're going to predict that because sellers like higher prices, a price going up will be good for them. Let's figure it out. Again, supply curve is here. Price, we'll call that price 0 is here. And we're going to have a producer surplus. That's going to be the area above the supply curve and below the price. And there you go. Now something happens and the price goes up. We'll learn about that later. Price is now higher, and you get the idea. As the price went higher, the area of total surplus, of producer surplus increased. It's now going to be this size here. So we would argue again that if prices go up, producer surplus goes up. And again, if we know the original triangle and the new triangle, we can figure out what the actual change in producer surplus is. In this case, it's this area here. Okay, so a simple tool to show how to work price changes into the incentives and rewards that sellers get. Finally, let's jump in to our concept of elasticity of supply. We know that supply curves can either be elastic or inelastic. Again, elasticity is a measure of responsiveness. So when we talk about elasticity of supply, we're trying to figure out just how responsive quantity supplied is to changes in price. Remember, the law of supply said as price goes up, QS goes up, and as price goes down, QS goes down. The law of supply is good. It tells us what's going to happen, but it stops there. Elasticity tells us by how much. Law of supply says if price goes up, QS goes up. Elasticity says how high does it go up? Okay. Law of supply says price and QS are responsive to each other. Elasticity says how responsive. And much like demand, we have this idea that curves can be either elastic or inelastic. A supply curve is said to be elastic when even a modest or small change in price causes a pretty big change in quantity supplied. Again, elastic supply, small price change, big change in QS, very responsive. On the other hand, supply is said to be inelastic by definition when quantity supplied is not very responsive to a change in price. Okay, let's do a couple real quick. We'll call this one here elastic. Much like demand, we typically assume that the flatter a slope is, the more elastic the curve is. We start off right here with this price. We'll call this price low. We go across, we hit it, we go down. There's quantity low. Let's say that there's a relatively small increase in price from price low to price high. It's just right there, pretty small. We take this line across, and we can see that a relatively small change here yields a big change here. That's elastic supply, price responsive. On the other hand, we can do down here an inelastic one. And we would say that inelastic supply curves tend to be fairly steep. call this steep line S, and you get the idea. Suppose that we start off with price high, we go across, hit the curve, and come down, and we have this quantity. Even a big change, look at this thing, big change in price, big drop in price. But when we take our curve, our line over and hit it and go down, we see that this big change in price yielded a fairly small change in quantity supplied. Not very responsive inelastic supply. And that, my friends, is it for the law of supply. Again, you have a basic idea, a basic definition that has to be rooted in you understanding the incentives that guide sellers. Once you know that law of supply, you can express it through symbols, through schedules, and through curves. You're going to be very careful about paying attention to the distinction between a quantity supply and a supply, because they sound similar, but they're totally different. Related, but different. And we took two extensions, producer surplus and elasticity. At this point now, you've got a primer in the law of demand, you've got a primer in the law of supply. And now we're ready to bring these two together and to actually build a market that brings buyers and sellers, supply and demand together. And we'll cover markets in our next lecture. Thank you. See you soon.